everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. As Nick said, I'm Dr. Kobe Kalix, and I'm delighted that so many people are keen to be involved in discussion about what sometimes feels like my niche interest in social impacts of citizen science. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from Ghana country in South Australia today. Pay my respects to traditional owners of the lands that we're on throughout Australia, particularly elders past and present, and give a special welcome to any Indigenous people joining us online today. We've got more than 100 people, which is wonderful. It would be great if all participants wanted to acknowledge in the chat whose country you're zooming in from this morning. I'm very conscious that, as well as my three presenters coming up, we have a wealth of expertise on chat here. I know we've got citizen scientists and people from organisations that support citizen science. So we're aiming to keep presentations short to allow time for discussion. And please share your questions via the chat as they come to mind throughout the presentations. And we're going to work to try and collate those so that maybe we'll have some themes emerging to discuss when we reach discussion time. First up, we're going to have Alice and Max, who are each going to present for less than 10 minutes. Then we're going to allow a bit more time for Casey's story of her lived experiences through and in response to this year's devastating fires. I work for the Centre for Social Impact. If Nick can move to the next slide about that, that would be fantastic. And CSI has three partner universities, UWA, Swinburne and UNSW, where I'm based, with support from UNSW Science to look at science impact. I haven't got control of the screen, so I'm hoping that Nick's going to be able to move that along. CSI produces research that catalyses social change and courses for social impact. We aim to build capacity in the for-purpose sector and bring people together in creating social change. You can find out more at csi.edu.au. And another organisation I'm involved with in the for-purpose sector is the Australian Citizen Science Association. And I'm not controlling the screen, so I'm hoping that we can move the slides forward to a slide about that now. So our next two presenters are also on the managing committee of AXA, as am I now. The AXA website says that citizen science involves public participation and collaboration in scientific research with the aim to increase scientific knowledge. Now, this is definitely true, but I'm also interested in some other aims. I'm interested in how citizen science can increase people's sense of connection with environments and communities. I'm interested in the aim of promoting participatory governance and active citizenship. And I'm interested in the assumption that public participation always increases knowledge, and mindful that ideals of open access for all are constrained by things that other CSI researchers focus on, for example, digital inclusion. But before we get into that too much more, oh, now I can see everybody's amazing faces rather than the slides.
So something must be, apologies everyone, hi, this is Rhonda.
Right, sorry, it's Nick. Yeah, I'm having, for some reason, it won't let me control the slides. So even though I can see it, I realise you can't. So I'm just going to start sharing again.
Apologies for that. So hopefully, for the purposes of my intro, basically you just missed a slide about CSI and a slide about AXA and that citizen science definition that I just mentioned. So there we go, beautiful. So I think we're on track now, so everyone can see that. Which is good timing, because if we can move to the next slide, I think it will be the first one for Associate Professor Alice Motion. So I'm going to hand over to her now. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Kobe, and thanks so much, Nick. I'm joining everybody today from Gadigal lands, and I'd also like to acknowledge the elders from these lands and any Indigenous people who are present on this call. It's a real pleasure to talk to you all today. I'd like to share a short story about how I got involved in citizen science and its importance for social impact from the perspective of somebody who trained as a chemist and works in the School of Chemistry at the University of Sydney. I'm also a member of AXA on the management committee, and I co-chair the citizen science node at the University of Sydney. And really, the thread that brought me to citizen science was a real interest in issues of access and equality of access to medicines. I first moved to Australia in 2012 to take up a postdoctoral position working with Professor Matthew Todd, who's pictured on this slide, to work for the Open Source Malaria Consortium. And this was funded by a linkage grant from the Medicines for Malaria venture and the Australian government. And open source malaria has been going from strength to strength. It's a drug discovery initiative that operates in a very similar way to many drug discovery initiatives, in that we're trying to find new medicines, in this case for malaria. And the difference is that everything is completely open. It's an open source project with all ideas shared freely on the internet, and anyone can participate. And I was working for open source malaria for a long time, and I still collaborate, and I'm a member of this consortia. And what drives this motivation, if we can just switch to the next slide, please, Nicola, is issues of access and equity of access to medicine. We know as chemists that it costs a huge amount of money to design and manufacture a new drug. Typical figures are given as 3.6 billion Australian dollars. And 12 years for a drug to come from the research laboratory into the pharmacy. And if we look at this figure, which is huge, there's a lot of risk involved in this process. About a quarter of that is spent on marketing, but only 1.3% is spent on research. So there seems to be some kind of say a disparity in those figures, so potential for another approach that could maybe help to find medicines, particularly for diseases that have low market incentive, like malaria. So malaria affects over 200 million people a year and kills between 400 and 500,000 people. And the tragedy here is of course that impact on people's lives, but also the fact that we know that malaria is both treatable and preventable. So we need, new interventions in this space. So if we just move to the next slide, I'll just show you a little bit about the 6 laws of open science that kind of frame open source malaria and were developed by Matt Todd. I won't read them to you. I can summarize these very quickly as everything is shared. So everything is really available for everyone. You can see all of the data for the project. All of the discussions take place in online webinars, a little bit like this, and anyone can participate. And it was this working as part of this project that really made me realize that if we removed all of the secrecy from this project, which is really rare for drug discovery, really anyone could take part. And surely that could mean citizens and younger people too. And I hadn't really married the idea of this being citizen science at the beginning when we started our first, attempts at this, working with undergraduates at the University of Sydney and at universities around the world. But by the time we started partnering with school children, we'd started to realize that this project could have quite a far-reaching impact as a citizen science project. If we go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about that citizen science project. Some of you may know the most famous fictional character who started to make drugs with his school students. We won't go into that story right now, but that show is Breaking Bad. We don't work on making illicit drugs, of course. We work on making medicines. So we called our project, and I'll show you now if we Breaking Good. So this is a project that involves young people, citizens in drug discovery. And I'm going to show some chemistry on the next slide. For non-chemists, don't worry, I'm going to explain it. But this is a typical route. So each of these black structures represents something along the way to a drug molecule. And in the final image in the bottom right, we can see this triazolopyrazine core shown in black, and there's a blue blob and a green blob. And basically what we want the students to do is to add different chemical ingredients to the synthesis to make final products that have different chemical groups in the place where the blue blob is and different chemical groups in the place where the green blob is. So we've done a lot of work in getting students to follow this safe synthetic route and to make many compounds, and many of them have been tested. And this was towards our work to make potential new anti-malarial drugs. But we also have done a little bit of work on recreating medicines. And this, if we switch to the next slide, kind of explains another part of this story that links to social impact and the thread of equity of access to medicines. Many of you will have heard the story of Daraprim. For brevity, I'll just explain that this is one of the World Health Organization's essential medicines. It was initially developed by, an image might come up now if Nicola presses this for me, by Gertrude Elion, who's a Nobel Prize winning scientist, an exceptional person who developed this drug in the early 1960s. But this medicine was, despite being off patent, being over 60 years old, it was hiked in price in the United States in 2015. And overnight, the price went from $13.50 a pill to $750 a pill. So an increase of 5,500%. It's an essential medicine for the treatment of a parasite called toxoplasmosis that's largely innocuous. But if you're pregnant or if you're a person living with HIV or AIDS, it can be a really dangerous condition. So it's an essential medicine. And we work with local high school students to recreate this drug. And there's an image that will come up now from very cheaply available starting materials. And on the right, in the little white, in the vial with some white powder, there's about 4 grams of the active ingredient of this drug, so Daraprim, that at the time was worth, and I would use heavy air quotes here, over $100,000 US. But of course, it's not worth that. It's very cheap and easy to make. So we work with these students to really help them to develop some chemical skills, but importantly, to start to have conversations with young people, with citizens, about access to medicines and issues of inequality here. And I'll just summarize in the last slide before I hand over to one of my colleagues that we just launched actually today, and by coincidence, an online project for Breaking Good. Everything has to move online at the moment for obvious reasons. And we've launched the Essential Medicines Project. We'd love to have your help. Some of the members of the team are shown here: Dr. Yela Golumbik, Hung Fat Dong, Kimberly Scroggy, and Professor Peter Rutledge. And what we're asking people to do is to start the process of understanding more about the pricing, availability, and accessibility of the medicines that are on the World Health Organization's list all around the world. And we're crowdsourcing this approach and involving members of the public in this research. And we're really excited to see where this will take us. So I think I've had my time now. It's great to be here, but I'd like to pass to my colleague now, Dr. Max, or Dr. Maxine Newlands, to take us through the next stage of this webinar.
Thanks very much, Alice. Yep, I'm Dr. Maxine Newlands. I'm based up in Townsville in tropical North Queensland. I've seen a few names from people from Brisbane, so welcome to this section. And I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners on the land in which I work, where James Took is out in Townsville, but also I work right across the reef space, and I'm a political scientist here in Townsville. And so what I'm going to do now is really just talk to you about the other components that citizen science can help, that citizen science can help people in order to develop policy, in order to develop governance, to shape how we think, and also to take ownership. So it's really important. It's all about kind of participatory governance. So citizen science is what we call grassroots, if you like. It's really can range from anything from going down the beach and clearing up the plastic and the rubbish and noting down what it is, right through to sort of big citizen research projects that will help inform future research. So looking at the socio-political aims, it really, the easiest way of putting this, it's all about the human dimension. So it's the people in the research, it's the people that comes into the science. It's about understanding and using citizen science in order to understand cultural and social. What do we need from our communities? What do we want? How can we help? How can science projects help our communities? And so really the socio-political aims of citizen science is around reorientating science towards the complexity of environmental problems. And it becomes a democratic part of the process because we all have a say. You know, politics 101, democracy is all about having the voice within the community. That's why we vote. And so citizen science, again, can give you that kind of democratic governance in the way that we look at it. So we have the next slide, please. So how does it work? Well, it's really about all of us taking responsibility and taking some role in creating a strong science community, in creating a strong research community, and it's also about ownership of our local areas. So it's from the local to the global, where we have stakeholder engagement, and that is a term where we're talking about. So, for example, on the Reef, we're talking about working with tourism groups, working with local schools, we have a great project that's run by the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, called Eye on the Reef, where every time a backpacker and a tourist goes out, they take a snap on their phone, upload it to Instagram, and that all gets measured. And then they can keep an eye on the kind of fish that are out there and what's happening in the reef. But it's also about political socialization. If we want to do something, whether it be about climate change or whether it be about bushfires, which you're going to hear about shortly, or really, we've got the ongoing issues around coronavirus at the moment, and citizen science enables us to be politically active. And doesn't have to be, marching with banners or going down to Parliament. You can socially be political through citizen science. Next slide. And the way we do this really is through governance. So governance, if you like, is the rules of the game. If government is how the mechanics of politics, if you like, how government works, then governance are the components in which civil society works. So it's all the different rules that we adhere to, the structure, the hierarchical, the bottom up, the top down. And as Dryzek talks about, there's several different ways in which governance can work, both at national level, at global level. So for example, the IPCC or the Conference of the Parties, but also things like network governance. And that really is where citizen science comes in. You work with your local community, you work with your local researchers, and you build a network of doing citizen science. And from that, you can grow and start having influence around policy and policy development. And really, unfortunately, in the democracy system or the Western system in which we work, policy drives so many decisions around funding, around the direction of where money is going to come from government, around research, and what happens on your local doorstep. So having a say in policy is super, super important. But there are other components as well. If we can go to the next slide, please. Wait for it to click through. So why volunteer as a citizen science? As I say, it's all about recognition, attribution, feedback, and community involvement. It's about taking part in your local community. And once you get a groundswell of people talking or doing citizen science, then the politicians and the policymakers and the local council, they do pay attention. And so it's a good way to raise issues. It's a good way to change or to try and influence the political system, so you don't feel so helpless. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to summarize with this final slide. This is a study that was done in the EU with 45 groups around citizen science, and what they found was that citizen science, right in the middle, both impacts, gives government support not only in funding but through active participation. It means that we can easily engage in this top-down, bottom-up. So we do citizen science, it influences policy, policy then helps develop more citizen science. It also creates a very strong determined scientific aspect, and it serves to project policy and to make sure that we can have a say and an ownership within this process. So that's really kind of looking at the human dimensions from a political perspective of what citizen science can do. So I'm now going to hand you over to Casey Kirchhoff, who is a PhD candidate.
Thanks for that, Maxine. I'd just like to start by saying that I'm currently down on the south coast of New South Wales. So I'd like to acknowledge the elders and traditional custodians of the Yuin Nation, and also Gundagara, which features quite heavily in my bushfire story. So as Maxine mentioned, I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales in the School of Biological, Earth and Environmental Sciences. So I'm an ecologist, plant scientist really by trade. I study the alpine flora of Australia. And I'm quite new to citizen science from a research angle. I have spent a long time as a citizen scientist for biodiversity purposes, but after the bushfires, that kind of spurred me into kind of starting a project, and I'll tell you a bit more about that. So today I'll be sharing my bushfire story and how that led me to kind of wanting to do something positive out of such a sense of loss. So can we get the orange sky picture up, sorry? Yep. So just a little bit about this picture. So this was taken from my parents' balcony, which is where I was evacuated to. We evacuated our property, which is a little rural place in the bush in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales. We evacuated on New Year's Eve because there was a high fire danger and risk that the Currawong fire was going to move up into our region. So we left. The fire didn't come on New Year's Eve, but it did come a couple of days later. So this was the sky from the smoke that was burning from the Currawong fire down on the south coast that was being slowly pushed forward by a southerly wind. If we can just go to the next slide, and the next four will be in quite quick succession. So I was laying in bed on the 4th of January after seeing that orange sky and knowing that a big strong southerly front had come through. I was thinking maybe we would have gotten out of it, but just before I dozed off to sleep and obsessively refreshing the Fires Near Me app, I noticed that the fires were spotting 2 doors down from my house, and then more and more fires were spotting, and then between the fire spots, the area got filled in, and so I knew it was looking pretty bad for us, that it was a high chance that we were going to lose our property. And the next slide just shows that when I woke up the next morning, pretty much most of Winchello's covered in the black burnt zone. So it was kind of funny screenshotting these at the time, but I go back to them regularly and just look at them to kind of relive the stress and anxiety of just waiting for kind of the inevitable to happen with the bushfire. So just go to the next one. So we did lose our property. So we went back up there 2 days later. Our neighbour had confirmed with us on that day that we had lost our house. We couldn't go back there immediately because of the emergency services needing access and the danger of the area. But 2 days later, we went back up. It was absolute destruction. It was black, thick, acrid smoke everywhere. And when it's a bushfire like that in an area that's burnt houses, it's not just wood smoke, it's plastics and whatever you had in the house, everything's burnt and smouldering and smoking. It was a really not anything that I would recommend anyone wanting to go through. But so it, that was pretty shocking, but it's not all bad. And if we go to the next slide. So it didn't take too much longer for things to start coming back. So me as an ecologist, I was very eager to start trying to find any sort of signs of life. I mean, I knew that the eucalypt trees, they weren't killed, but seeing these little spikes of hope, I call them, down in one of the wet areas of our property, really kind of absolutely filled me with a desire to go out and basically obsessively record things that were coming back to our property, the animals, fungi, the plants, everything that I could kind of lay my hands on. So first I would do that on my own property, but then, thinking back, wow, the fire grounds covered such an extent of the east and south coast of Australia. Other people are probably thinking the same. So there's other homeowners, there's other people that have a connection to country that really want to probably go out there and watch the healing process after such a devastating event. So just the next slide. So this is actually a video that we recorded. That'll be included in the downloadable files that get sent through. So we'll just go to the next slide. So after, it really only took about 5 days or so after seeing those little green spikes of hope to sit down and start having a chat with some of my colleagues in the Centre for Ecosystem Science at UNSW to think, okay, let's put down a project here. We feel like this could be something that a lot of people want to get on board with. A lot of us were already citizen scientists ourselves on the iNaturalist platform. So we leveraged the ease of creating a project on that platform and came up with the Environment Recovery Project. So between losing my house and launching the project, it was about a 3-week turnaround. And it was quite an interesting time in my life. It was obviously dealing with the loss of our property. And pretty much as soon as that happened, we had media requests coming through because people wanted to speak to bushfire victims, and Winslow, which is the little town that we live in, got a lot of attention because of the severity of the fire. So, you know, I had been doing quite a bit of media interviews that time, but when we launched the project itself, there was just a huge flurry of media interest, which was absolutely fantastic because that obviously contributed enormously to the success of the project. But at the same time, it was quite draining to have to kind of leverage my own mental health and you know, make sure that I was staying on top of everything, trying to get the project up and running, and also deal with my grief in losing the property and so much of the bushland. So we'll just go to the next slide. So this is just a little bit of a, you know, to give you an idea of what was going on there. Like that, I actually, just to humour myself, Googled my name yesterday when I was trying to put a few things together, and there's all sorts of stuff that has popped up from all around the world, not just relating to the Citizen Science Project, but also the loss of the property and dealing with that. So it was quite an intense time as somebody who's usually quite introverted, to have my phone ringing constantly and dealing with media requests. It definitely is something that I probably still am getting used to. We'll just go to the next slide. But you know, as much as that took some coping, it was actually fantastic because we really did have rapid uptake of the project. So this map kind of shows the fire grounds in grey there on the map. So that's taken from satellite imagery, hotspot data, and those little coloured dots are just some of the observation fields that we have gotten citizen scientists to fill out, and a few of the observations that have come in. And one of the things that we're really, really happy about is how quickly things can happen. So the bar chart down the bottom there, the red shows the fire hotspot data, the fire front movement, and then the blue bars indicate when we started to get citizen scientists submitting observations to the project. So really between the end of January and say mid-February, we had quite a lot of data coming in already right across the Australian fire grounds. And this, I kind of forgot to mention before, but this is obviously a project that looks at biodiversity. And in the media, there was a lot of imagery coming through of regenerating bushland around this time as well. And this was really positively received, it seemed, in the community. It was seeming to really give people a sense of hope that things could come back, especially in areas that were really badly affected, like the Blue Mountains and the South Coast. So we've found that not only can you get extremely rapid responses, and that after such a widespread disaster like the bushfires, citizen scientists are extremely keen to get on board. Their data is also extremely accurate. So we found that the fields that we were asking them to fill out were really accurately filled out when we measured that against satellite imagery and hotspot data. So citizen scientists are really contributing like enormously to biodiversity research in a time that has now become quite difficult for the scientists to actually get out into the field. So just next slide. And one thing that I've really found is within the citizen scientists community that we've generated here in the project, there's a lot of support and a lot of commenting going on people's observations. So this is things, just a couple of examples here with some of the animals that have come through. So there's conversations going on about, the complications and the difficulty of feral animal management. And then we've got our little koala in the middle, submitted from Kangaroo Island, and kind of the shared grief in seeing an animal in poor condition in a burnt tree. And over on the right there, we've got some kangaroos that have been submitted. And this, sorry, the text is actually really tiny here. I'm sorry about that. But a lot of the citizen scientists are actually contributing extremely detailed descriptions with their observations. So the one on the top there gives us information on the animal behaviour, its condition, time since fire, and the one down the bottom, this citizen scientist is basically offering to help in any way by contributing the long-term data that they've been collecting on their own property. So it's just been really great to see all these people from across the firegrounds come together with this kind of shared goal in documenting the recovery of biodiversity. And I think we're nearly at the end there. Yeah, so I'll just quickly end on saying that this project is ongoing. Future directions, we're really hoping that we can get a bit of a team together and actually get on the ground and do a bit of a roadshow through the firegrounds once the pandemic's over, so that we can actually remind people that we're thinking of them. We want to see how, their patch of bush is recovering, and actually, make contact so that people feel that they're not being forgotten about. So with that brings us to the end of the talks, and now we're going to do a Q&A. So I'll hand you over to Kobe.
Thank you so much, Casey, and thank you for making the time to share your experiences with us in what's been a really full-on year for you and losing your home, and thanks for your leadership in recovery. I think you're doing an exceptional job, as did Alice and Max in their presentations as well today. So thanks. We've already got some questions coming in. We've got more than 20 minutes for questions now, so I encourage you to share questions in the chat, and I will try and go through them, and we'll see if we can get through a lot of them. I might group them a little bit where practical. We've got a couple of questions coming in about technology platforms and infrastructure, both for engaging participants, so not so much on platform but off platform in terms of social media, and Casey mentioned the mainstream media playing a role in that. So what platforms are useful for gaining traction, for getting people involved? But someone else also asked, what kind of tech infrastructure did you have in place when the project started? Which I think is one that maybe Casey can address first, because it's front of mind, but also Alice, I'm interested in the tech infrastructure side of things, for one of the examples you've shared. So maybe you two can start sharing with that one.
Yeah, so I'll just kick off with, so we used a pre-existing program, the iNaturalist network. So this is based in California in the United States. So basically any person can go in and create a project so long as they've been a member of the platform and submitted a sufficient number of observations. And that has a turnaround of instant, basically. So you can just put in the parameters that you want to look at for the project and then get that submitted and it's ready to go. So we didn't have to code up a new project or write an app or anything like that. And I think that's really where we've gotten a benefit in the rapid turnaround, by having that infrastructure there freely available, ready to go.
Thanks, Katie. So I guess Katie comes from the perspective of having a platform that's been really well established and has been adapted and used by different projects, which is a real strength. that's not what we did, and maybe we should have done to begin the project. One of the challenges we have is that there are lots of elements in terms of wanting participants to be able to have notebooks, electronic lab notebooks that mirror what the kind of record keeping that we would keep in the lab, as well as discussions too. So what we used initially was a platform called GitHub that some of you may be familiar with, some of you may not. It's traditionally used for sharing code and for sharing open source code, but it's a platform that is freely available to people with open projects. So we use this to organize the Breaking Good project, because this is what we used in open source malaria. So using a little bit of a mixture of that with sort of optionality, but there are we're constantly trying to think about the best platform, and this is a big issue for the project. For the new Essential Medicines project, we've chosen to use Google's Forms, because that's a very accessible and quite intuitive way of collecting information. But I would say we're constantly trying to think about this, and if we had had more funding at the beginning, I think we would have made maybe some decisions about how we set up these platforms too. So it's something that I'm really interested in.
Thank you both. Maxine, there's a couple of questions in about if there's research on whether the types of projects are more likely to involve people in other political advocacy. I wondered if you wanted to tackle that one.
Yeah, people tend, if they are going to do something, they're already doing something. That makes sense. So people do tend to be involved in other groups, whether they're involved in environmental groups or citizen science groups. They do tend to also be then, part of a larger cohort. As far as AXA goes, that's not something we've done yet at the moment. And, we're an apolitical group, so I'd be a little bit cautious about surveying our members around politics. So nothing specific to AXA, but it's certainly, I guess it all depends as well, because sometimes when things can be like single issue, so if you can see lots of plastic, for example, on your local beach or, in your local park, you might want to start doing some data collection that way. And so it's a sort of single issue local where that'll spur someone on. But then there's a sort of big deal things like we've just seen with Casey's story around bushfires, and people that might not necessarily be directly affected, but want to try and help so that, when it happens again, that there's a sort of better set of data to prepare for it.
I am familiar with, from my work in South Australia, I'm familiar with some instances of policy impact that some people have been asking questions about. I'm just going to share a link to Nina James, who's recently done her PhD in citizen science and impacts, and she found from interviews that people were more politically engaged as a result of their participation. And there's an EU project happening as part of the We Observe project about policy impacts in citizen science. And there's cases from both Queensland and South Australia in that, both from the perspective of koala counting, which is interesting because they're very different population policy issues across Queensland and South Australia. So there are cases in the Australian context of how citizen science has contributed to policy impact, and some emerging research about how people become more politically engaged through this. We've got a bunch of questions coming in now, which is fantastic, and we've still got 15 minutes, so please do share more. Someone has asked, Alice, how many schools do you have involved in the Breaking Good project? And linked to, well, not really linked to that, so maybe we'll tackle that first, but then Casey, to give you something to think about first, someone was asking about whether there was potential for your kind of method to apply to, for example, land clearing recovery as well. So let's keep that one for next, but we'll get Alice to talk about the Breaking Good student participation first.
So presently we have 4 partner schools in Australia and 1 in the UK, but only 2 of the partner schools in Australia have commenced synthesis just yet. We had a big plan to push this year and to involve more schools, but that will be on hold until things have settled down a little bit. So that was part of the motivations for setting up this the Essential Medicines project that people can participate in without having to do synthetic chemistry research, so that they can participate in a different way. And one of the things we're working at, we were lucky to be awarded some a Google Impact Challenge funding for the Breaking Good project. So one of the things we're working on is really expanding this to many more schools, including schools without the equipment that some other schools might have. So really trying to get this to rural schools, to public schools, of course, and some of the ways we're doing that is by developing kits and also trying to lend equipment where required. So in terms of increasing school involvement, that will be a little bit limited to what happens this year, but we're hoping that maybe this online project will also help us to make some more connections to schools and communities in that way.
Casey, did you want to share a little bit about how your experience might apply to some other related fields?
Yeah, for sure. It absolutely can be applied to any sort of question like that, especially if it's something like biodiversity and recovery. If you're looking at anything that has to do with animals, fungi, plants, you can easily use these pre-existing platforms like iNaturalist or Atlas of Living Australia or Quest a Game to be able to go into a designated area that relates to your question and then document what's there. If you've got baseline data, that's great. If not, you just go in after the event of interest. In our case, it's bushfires. It could be land clearing. It could be mine remediation. Just basically anywhere that citizen scientists can get access to. It's totally applicable. Yeah.
And someone's been asking about project design. Something we didn't get into today is talking about how projects are designed. Co-design is something I like to talk about. So someone was asking about human-centered design approaches. And yeah, I guess approaches to participation. I wonder if anyone would like to tackle that.
I think just talking from the perspective of the reef space, it's often an initiative that's started by stakeholders and by big organisations, but there's always an objective that in a second phase that the group itself that are doing the citizen science will take more ownership. And then that goes on then to sort of spread beyond that. So particularly in the reef space, that seems to be the process in which project design, where it's in effect co-design. And it's also particularly prominent it's important to work in sea country culture and to co-design with traditional owners and with Indigenous groups as well, so that the project doesn't have an add-on later on. Everyone knows where they stand from the beginning.
And we also have a couple of questions related to open health. So perhaps this is one for you, Alice. But someone was asking if they know of any open health initiatives, any open health projects. I know, for example, some of the flu tracker and COVID-related citizen science projects emerging. Some of them include surveys, for example, about mental health, but I wouldn't necessarily say the data is open. And also, Jack was talking about or asking about how people are evaluating and reporting on initiatives, and talking about potentially public involvement in genomics research, which I have a background in, but that's probably a conversation for another time. But yeah, any comments on the open health kind of side of things and data sharing in that space?
Yeah, I think one, obviously open data also has to be data that's fair and that's carefully put together and doesn't jeopardize anybody or any people, which is always a challenge in the health space. In addition to the projects that Kobe mentioned, there's been several that are fascinating to do with people sharing personal information from their wearables in terms of understanding more about health. The Citizen Science Node at Sydney University is situated in the Charles Perkins Centre, which is is a really great place for lots of health and medicine research. And one of the projects that's really interesting, I find really interesting, is run by Jean, who's a professor and the chair of the node, and that's a Step Up for Dementia project. So I think what we're seeing is more and more approaches to empower people to share their own personal data so that they can understand, we can better understand, and they can better understand their health needs. And I think that this is a really growing area of citizen science.
Thanks. There are a couple of questions about whether you needed to link in with curriculum to get schools involved, Alice. And then for the other presenters potentially as well, someone's been asking about ways to keep citizen science programs running during COVID restrictions. So for those kind of projects that do involve real world participation, like water monitoring or litter collection, any suggestions for how to kind of keep these things going in this time where obviously we're all social distancing?
So in terms of the curriculum, the first projects were very much extracurricular, sort of extension projects, but they now tie into the depth studies that are students are asked or required to study in some cases for HSC. And as we move down, because the synthetic projects are really targeted at more senior students for probably quite obvious reasons, so that they've learned a lot about science and are starting to learn how to do experimentation too. As we kind of map our projects for younger students, we're really trying to tie those into the syllabus, because our wish is really to create something that really is exciting for the students, but it is also helpful to the teachers, who are really doing a wonderful job and really overworked and could do with anything that can kind of fit into that curriculum. So that's what we're working on a little bit now. In terms of keeping things going, one of the things is adapting. So trying to think of a different angle for the project, or a different piece of data that might be interesting, which is kind of what we've tried to do. So we'll see how that goes. But I think what we've seen is that many of the major projects have made adaptations. So for example, in recent sort of bio blitzes, whereas we would have typically asked people to wander around their cities and to make observations, you can see that people have been making much more local observations, so in their own homes, in their own gardens, and actually maybe this is, in a bit of a meta way, something that would be really interesting for us to study was what new things have we found out because of some of these restrictions on the projects, and what questions have we been able to ask or found out answers to that we wouldn't really have thought of, maybe on a more, on a kind of smaller scale, that kind of leads to a much bigger picture. So I'm really curious to see, what we find out during this time.
Thanks, Alice. Debbie's asked, is there a platform to continue the discussion around citizen science and social impact with this group? Which I love as a question, because as I mentioned at the start, sometimes I feel like this is my niche area of interest, and I was hoping that this would bring together people who have expertise and interest in this area. And there's been some discussions about different evaluation frameworks that people are working on as well. So someone suggested a Lumio group. I love Lumio, so I'm definitely going to join that after. And I'm really keen for people who are interested in kind of pursuing these conversations to get involved in a community of practice, and I'm open to suggestions. Let's approach this as a co-design thing about how to do that. I'd love CSI and AXA to be involved, obviously, but I can't speak on behalf of those organisations. And personally, I'm very, very keen to see that happen. So I encourage you to follow up in the various ways that people have already suggested, because as I mentioned at the start, we have a wealth of expertise in that chat as well. But I'll try to pull together some of these things. I've just shared my email again. And hopefully in following up with the webinar recording, we can also share kind of how we might move forward with that. So we've still got another 6 minutes for questions. I think for the evaluation, it sounds like there are a bunch of people who are keen to talk about kind of evaluation and building in this space. So maybe we'll save that as something let's move forward with. And let's spend the next few minutes just kind of bringing together some of the presentations that we've had today, but that's what I'm excited about. I'm excited to join that Lumio group. I'm excited to be involved in developing this community of practice. So thank you, people, for triggering that kind of forward-thinking discussion. So we've talked a little bit about the curriculum links and things like that, and some of the face-to-face projects that are having more challenges now as a result of COVID. I think I missed a couple of questions earlier that were related to Casey's project. So, and people are now sharing lots of great stuff, which is fantastic. So we've got another 5 minutes. If there's questions related to the actual presentations we've had today, I'd love to round them off now, because then we can include them kind of in the webinar recording that we share later. So this is your last chance, I guess, to ask questions. And I'm going to trawl back up to see if I missed any. If I did miss yours earlier, please share it again at the bottom. So Chris has asked Alice to, and again, this is something we might not have the time to go into. Can you explain funding mechanisms for drug research outside of big drug companies? And Colin, to quickly answer your question, I know that in terms of acoustic monitoring, Jessie in Queensland has done her PhD on acoustic or audio recordings in citizen science. She's the international liaison for AXA, so her details are available on the AXA website. But yes, funding mechanisms outside of big drug companies, do they exist?
I'll try and do a really short answer to this, but happy to continue the discussion afterwards. Yes, mainly government funding, philanthropic funding. For example, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have given a lot of money to malaria research over the years, but it remains a big challenge, and trying to do these sorts of things in a new way without patents, for example, as is one of the drives of open source malaria and the open source pharma foundation, is a real challenge. But there are lots of people meeting, economists, lawyers, scientists, all sorts of people to try and take those conversations further. And there have even been high-level papers written by the UN on different models for funding drugs. So I think there are, but it is a challenge, of course, outside of that traditional system. But happy to continue this conversation at another time too, because that was a very short answer.
And Stephanie, who's also from the AXA Management Committee, has, I guess, reinforced that, yes, AXA is keen to be involved in these discussions and things, and would love people to share examples of projects through AXA. So by all means, become an AXA member, as most of us are, and participate in those discussions. Thank you so much, CSI, my wonderful workplace, for hosting the webinar today and kind of kicking us off on being able to all share in this new way. Thanks again, Casey, for your exceptional efforts in the last few months and for displaying such exceptional resilience. And yeah, we're all experiencing a lot of change at the moment, but in particular, you've been navigating this amazingly, and we all wish you well in continuing to do so, but also we also want to make sure you have time to recover and actually do PhD and things. So thanks very much. And also to Maxine and Alice for helping to set the scene and be involved in today. Thanks to the behind the scenes team at CSI who've made this happen. And thank you in particular to Rhonda for wrangling us, who were unwieldy academics at times, and I apologise again for that, as well as Nick and Pam and the rest of the CSI team who have been behind the scenes making this work. We'll be sharing the webinar recording, firstly with the people that have been registered. So if you were registered for this session and you're here, then it means that you will get that and the associated resources that we'll share through the chat, for example, because as I hoped happened, thank you so much for participating in the chat and meaning that we do have this shared network and resources. So those links and things we'll share as well. And then later on, part of the presentations will be shared publicly as well for people who missed out today. Thank you again very, very much. I want us to keep to time because I respect that everybody has a lot of things to do, and I'm excited about where we can go from here in terms of building a community of practice looking at social impacts of citizen science. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of day in the circumstances and find a moment to get outside, even if it's just out on your balcony, if nowhere else. I think that I will leave it there because it's noon in Adelaide. It's already 12:30, I think. No, this is my Sydney time. It's noon. It's noon on the East Coast. I've still got half an hour before midday where I am. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation.